Great. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Morgan with the International Labor Organization's Office for the United States and Canada, based in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for joining us here today for what promises to be a great discussion, I think, one that ties very well with the overall theme for this year's conference of elevating voice. And as you've seen, we're focusing specifically on collective bargaining. Collective bargaining played a crucial role during the pandemic, and it definitely provides an effective means for employers and workers to tackle the new challenges that are shaking up the world of work. And so I'm very excited to have a chance to join this fantastic group of speakers here today to highlight some recent research in this area, as well as new initiatives to help foster greater support for freedom of association and collective bargaining. So please feel free to put questions in the chat throughout the discussion. I'll try and incorporate them as we go, and we'll save a few minutes at the end as well for questions. But I'll quickly introduce our panelists and then we'll go forward. First, my colleague at the ILO, Dora Sari, who currently works as a specialist on industrial relations indicators at the ILO's Department of Statistics. She has close to 15 years of work experience in the field of international labor regulation, including co-developing both the Labor Rights Indicators database hosted at the Penn State University Center for Global Worker Rights and the ILO's Labor Provisions in Trade Agreements database. Mark Anner is the founding director of the Center for Global Worker Rights and a professor at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at Penn State. He holds a PhD in government from Cornell and a master's degree in Latin American studies from Stanford. And his current research examines the adverse impacts of purchasing practices on workers in global supply chains and efforts to address them through binding agreements, labor organizing, and collective bargaining. Lance Compa is a senior lecturer emeritus at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. He technically retired in 2019 after 22 years as senior lecturer at Cornell ILR, where he taught US labor and employment law and international labor rights. Before joining Cornell, he directed labor law research at the NAFTA Labor Commission, working with a tri-national staff of lawyers and economists in comparative studies of labor law and labor markets in North America. He also taught labor law, employment law, and international labor rights as a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School and the Yale School of Management, and practiced international labor law for unions and human rights organizations in Washington, D.C. He continues to work with colleagues at ILR on research and undertakes various labor rights consulting projects for unions and NGOs. And Molly McCoy is the Associate Deputy Undersecretary for International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs, or ILAB. Prior to joining ILAB, she worked at the Solidarity Center, most recently as a member of the Solidarity Center's senior management team, where she developed and led congressional outreach on international worker and human rights issues, and previously as the regional program director for the Americas, among many other areas. So with that fantastic set of speakers, I'm excited for the discussion to start. Dora, I'd like to start and turn to you first to give an overview of the recent report, the first flagship report that the ILO has produced on collective bargaining. So if I can turn to you, please.
Yeah, thanks so much. Let me just quickly start screen sharing. I hope this is working. Can you see it well? All right, perfect. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining, especially in this particular time of lunchtime on a Sunday. As Sarah mentioned, I brought a brief presentation on the first flagship report on social dialogue that actually was made publicly available exactly a month ago. So this is still fresh out of the print. The focus of the report, as Sarah mentioned, is collective bargaining, and this is quite appropriate given the ILO's mandate and its normative framework, and also the extensive framework of international labor standards that were created over the past 100+ years. Now, The report treats collective bargaining as a voluntary negotiation practiced in good faith between employers and their organizations, and trade unions or labor unions on the other hand. Being a voluntary negotiation between the parties themselves, it's also quite a unique mechanism for regulating conditions of work and terms of employment, mechanism that is enacted by the parties themselves. So basically, representative actors in the world of work jointly create new standards or implement, tailor, enhance minimum statutory standards. The report has two main parts and is divided into 6 chapters. The first 3 chapters provide more of a global picture, looking at the regulatory framework, but also the regulatory coverage of collective bargaining agreements and the scope of collective bargaining agreements. There is a dedicated chapter that looks into employers, organizations, and trade unions, trends regarding their membership data, and also the role they play in general when it comes to collective bargaining, and more specifically, the role they played during the pandemic. The 5th chapter is the one that is dedicated to collective bargaining and the role it played during the pandemic. And then we have a final section which tries to identify some of the key priorities that could be strengthened in order for collective bargaining to play a more effective role in inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recovery. Oh, this isn't working. Let me see. Okay, like this. So when it comes to collective bargaining, of course, one of the key questions of the report is how collective bargaining contributes to what we call the inclusive and effective governance of work. And sort of coming up with this conceptual framework, we drew on the ILO's policy framework, previous research, and identified 3 main dimensions to collective bargaining. One, it being an enabling right. It is a fundamental workers' right. It is a human right and a right that should be granted to all workers. But it is also a voluntary negotiation process between autonomous and representative workers and employers organizations. And if it results in a collective bargaining agreement, then it would also be treated as a substantive regulatory outcome. Now, these are the 3 main elements that, as this image sort of represents, would hold the key for the inclusive and effective governance of work. Now, of course, the question, what exactly distinguishes this type of governance from other governance? And what the report conceptualizes and theorizes is that collective bargaining is a mechanism that is responsive. It allows the parties to tailor the rules and regulations to the particular needs of their industry, sector, or enterprise. And this was quite an important feature of collective bargaining during the pandemic itself or any other previous crisis. But also, which has been established by many previous research, it is also a tool for inclusive labor protection, either through the manner in which it is applied to enterprises and workers who otherwise would not have the right to collective bargaining, or through the content of collective bargaining agreements, the types of provisions that the parties themselves agree on, which can expand the coverage, can deal with gender equality, and so on and so forth. It is also a tool to facilitate the enabling environment for sustainable enterprises, or a mechanism that actually can strengthen compliance with basic labor rights. And throughout the pandemic, and actually the studies that are coming out of that period with the pandemic, more and more studies shows that workplaces that were unionized or where collective bargaining agreement existed, there actually was a higher level of protection in terms of health and safety regulation. And I think this is something that probably Mark will also talk a little bit more in detail. And finally, it is also an institute. Collective bargaining also has a particular institutional capacity for resilience, which again was quite important during the pandemic. Now, understanding just how strong collective bargaining is throughout the world, there are 2 main indicators that the ILO uses. Well, essentially 3, but focusing more on collective bargaining. One is a qualitative indicator, which is now currently known as SDG indicator 8.8.2, which deals with national level compliance with freedom of association and collective bargaining rights. It's a measure on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is the best possible score and 10 is the worst possible score, meaning 0 is the best, highest degree of compliance with these rights, fewer violations, and 10 is more violations and lack of compliance with basic rights of freedom of association and collective bargaining. And I just wanted to give a brief, outlook on the globe with the world and regional estimates. What this slide shows is that currently the global estimate is around 5.3. We do see a slight decrease, a slight improvement over the past 5 years, but I would say that this does not yet reflect on the pandemic years accurately. And there might also be something with a change in one of the reports that accounts for that slight improvement. But so for now, we see that at least from 2015 till 2020, we observed a slight improvement. The other indicator that we use, of course, is collective bargaining coverage rate. And this is the one that the report focuses on particularly. The map that you can see on the slide indicates with many of the gray zones that this isn't an easy data to collect. So the gray represents countries where we just don't yet have the data. We were able to gather and update data for 98 countries. And what we could see is that over 1/3 of the employees in those countries have their pay, working conditions, and terms of employment regulated by one or more collective agreements. The map shows that there is quite a large variation across the different countries, from countries over 25% and below, over 75% and below 25%. Currently, the US, based on the latest data, has about 12%, so it's not a wide coverage in the country. Now, the report looks into the various factors that can actually explain this variation, and then identifies a number of features. The first one is, of course, the legal coverage. Who has the right to collective bargaining, the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. The second aspect is the organizational features of workers and employers' organizations, how strong they are. This looks into the density rates, both at workers and employers' organizations. And the third one is the institutional setting and the manner in which collective bargaining agreements are applied. What the report really clearly can identify is that the most inclusive form of bargaining is the one that takes place at the multi-employer bargaining level, as opposed to a single employer enterprise level only bargaining. So with the multi-employer level bargaining, we have a coverage rate which is above 70%, and with the enterprise level only bargaining, we have under 16% of coverage rate. I wanted to put this slide up just because this is quite an interesting representation, just how complex issues are and how many types of issues there are that are regulated by the parties themselves. And so for this graph, the team actually reviewed more than 500 agreements across 80 countries. And we can see that there is quite a wide variation in how the various issues are being addressed. Now, the assessment was done through nine recurrent themes that were examined. These are the inner circle, so occupational safety and health, social protection, terms of employment, work transitions, and so on and so forth. And the analysis was able to draw out 6 main ways in which collective bargaining can make an important contribution to the inclusive and effective governance of work. Advancing equality by reducing earning inequality, promoting gender equality, inclusion of women, young people, migrant workers, and so on. But also, as I mentioned previously, really tailoring joint rules to the particular industry, enterprises, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the strongest way to really respond to emerging issues, including issues around work transition. Collective bargaining agreements can also complement social protection systems or reinforce statutory provisions on critical issues such as OSH. Finally, they can also encourage skills development or contribute to more sound industrial relations. I will not be talking in detail about the findings for the COVID, but we can always come back to it and sort of have a discussion during the Q&A session. I wanted to put up for the last slide just the key issues that the ILO in this particular report identified as main priority areas in order to use collective bargaining in a more effective way. The first one is the revitalization of employers and workers organization through membership recruitment or retention strategies. The second important one is something I mentioned already, is the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining for all workers. And I want to highlight that the ILO supervisory bodies have repeatedly affirmed the universal nature of these rights, covering all workers irrespective of their contractual status. The third one is promoting collective bargaining. Based on the findings we have, it's quite clear that there is still much that can be done to take advantage of collective bargaining's contribution to an inclusive and effective governance of work. And first and foremost, of course, it needs to take place within an enabling regulatory framework. We also highlight the importance of investing in peak level bipartite and tripartite social dialogue. And finally, reinforcing social dialogue for the achievement of sustainable development goals. And I will stop here, and I'm happy to talk about the details and hope I didn't go too much over the time. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dora. And it's just a very brief intro on the report, which there's a lot of rich data there. So hopefully everyone has a chance to check it out, and we can come back to some of the questions on it later. Now I'd like to turn to Mark to give some very practical examples of collective bargaining and its impact from some of your recent research. Mark.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah, and congratulations, Dora, Susan Hayter, the whole team. A really, really incredible contribution. So thrilled this report is out, and it comes out as at a timely moment because I was just finishing up my own little, much smaller report with a team from Honduras on collective bargaining there. I'm just adjusting my images here. So this is, we released this May 24th, Bargaining for Decent Work and Beyond, Transforming Work and Lives Through Collective Bargaining Agreements in the Honduras Maquila sector. So the Maquila sector is manufacturing exports. We cover auto parts, wire harnesses, textiles, but most especially garments. And here the puzzle that I'm, sort of been struggling with, a lot of us have, is looking at global supply chains. And when you have most value sort of accumulating outside national context, and we have all this literature on these global binding agreements, is what I call them, or enforceable brand agreements, co-governance, and so on. Let me pop up some slides. So my colleagues, Jem Baer and Jeremy Blasey did some, I think, very, very nice summary of those. What I see in the Honduran case is a combination and an interaction between this crucial national level collective bargaining and these global binding agreements. And I'll add, the more I reflect on it, this has also been influenced a bit by the CAFTA complaint mechanism and some labor law reform. So there is a component of a state reform going on in this as well. Real quick, some background. I should add that Lance knows this story inside out because he has served and as an ombudsperson for this process and done incredible work. So thanks, Lance, for that. So 2008, Russell's Fruit of the Loom, labor issues, there's organizing, the plant closes down, there's campaigning around that. It's said to be union avoidance. As a result of all this campaigning, universities, over 100 contracts and so on, we end up with what's called the Washington Agreement, which is a binding co-governance agreement that, similar in some ways to the Bangladesh Accord and others. Parts of the agreement include opening the factory, recognizing the union, and beginning the process of collective bargaining. And the agreement also allows for union access and training across all facilities. There's a side agreement which calls for neutrality. 2010, the factories opened. 2011, 18 months later, they signed the collective bargaining agreement. 2012, I'm adding this component to 2017, you have the CAFTA complaint process going on. There's some reforms that are important around the number of inspectors, and fines go dramatically up for violations. This is the main point I want to get to. You fast forward to, we did this at the end of last year, 22 collective bargaining agreements in the sector, very large factories. 44% of garment workers in Honduras are now covered by these collective bargaining agreements. So it goes way beyond the original Russell Fruit of the Loom case. Here are some photos from that, the actual negotiations, the opening of the factory in 2011, the bargaining agreement. We have this, I'm going to talk about this in the next round. We collected all the agreements and coded them. This is just a list of some of them, but again, 44% of garment workers covered by these. Some real quick, some of the impacts. Overall, we found a 6% wage premium with collective bargaining agreements versus without. We found in the garment sector, not only this important wage premium, but a closing of the gender wage gap to 2%, which is really quite incredible. Quick points of sort of subjects of bargaining. When you compare those with bargaining agreements and those not, this is based on survey research we did. Having voluntary overtime, 67%. You have a collective bargaining agreement. Having a lunch subsidy, 82%. Savings and loan account, 94%. Free transportation to work, 56%. Work intensity, the production quotas are not increasing, 83%. Important clauses on sexual harassment and gender-based violence and harassment at work, and we see this in the data. Workers who are not covered by collective bargaining agreements are 20% more likely to face verbal abuse. Female workers who are not covered by collective bargaining agreements are 11% more likely to face sexual harassment at work. And those workers who do face sexual harassment, 120% say they have a valid mechanism for addressing gender-based violence and harassment at work, usually through these systematic meetings that are part of the bargaining agreements where worker, labor, and management meet on a monthly basis. We looked at the question of migration, the causes for migration, probably not surprising, but the impact of this, we found that workers covered by collective bargaining agreements are 25.3% less likely to want to migrate to another country relative to workers who are not covered by collective bargaining agreement, which emphasizes the point that workers want not just any job, they want good jobs, and collective bargaining agreements help us to get there. And I'll just, for time, I'll end on this. As the bargaining agreements expand, the labor movement becomes stronger. As they become stronger, their relationship with the employers association and government representatives grow, and it allows them to go beyond the bargaining to bipartite and tripartite agreements. There's several around wages, around housing. The one I want to emphasize here is they bargain over labor support during the COVID initial lockdowns in 2020. And there's an agreement that employers will pay a part and the government will pay a part to workers during that lockdown period. So that's important. That's for everyone. But it wasn't binding, and what happens is the workers with the collective bargaining agreement are much more likely to get this benefit, but workers without also in very significant numbers got the benefit. I'll just say, so we have now, following this, I think as labor became stronger, it also contributed to this election of Xiomara Castro, who comes in January. But let me end there for time concerns. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I hope we get to hear a little bit more about some of the data gathering stage too a little bit later today. Lance, I'll turn to you, and feel free to comment on anything on the Honduras case as well. But we're hoping you can help bring together and tie some of your recent research on the linkages between international labor standards and U.S. companies and how that looks. And linking freedom of association, collective bargaining as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. And first of all, I want to tip my hat, if I had one, to Dora and Mark. Their reports are really significant. I mean, they're landmark reports in terms of comparative study of collective bargaining around the world, and Mark's country-focused study, really, digging deep into what can be accomplished through collective bargaining. And I have to say, if you'll allow a personal note, this really confirms my own experience. In an earlier life, before I entered the academy, I was a union representative, an organizer, and a negotiator, and I've negotiated dozens of contracts. And I really saw up close the magic of collective bargaining. I mean, this might be over romanticizing it to some extent, but it's really true that if parties come to the table in good faith and with an open mind and are willing to listen to each other and willing to compromise on points of detail and try to solve problems together, the results really are the best results, compared with if one side or the other imposed its position, or if the government intervened to impose a settlement. I mean, this really is a very special and precious dynamic that needs to be protected and nurtured and expanded. And I think Dora's and Mark's reports really advance that. I want to talk more specifically about a much more modest report that I did, published just a couple of weeks ago at the Berkeley Labor Center and the Berkeley Law School Center for Law and Work. This was a study of Amazon's freedom of association policy. And it was strictly desk-based research, nothing like what Dora did, managing a worldwide research effort, and what Mark did with he didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I hope he can, a really innovative methodology, and enlisting workers to do the actual work of research and interviews and producing the concrete results. My work was desk-based, but it was prompted by Amazon putting out a statement on March 11th, claiming to comply with international labor standards on workers' freedom of association and collective bargaining. And basically, Amazon put it out because there was going to be a shareholders resolution challenging the company's freedom of association activities at the shareholders meeting just last week. And the unions came to me and asked me if I could do a quick and dirty kind of rebuttal to the company's position, and I did that. Amazon put out a statement invoking the UN guiding principles and the ILO core labor standards declaration and so on. But I worked with Ken Jacobs at the Berkeley Labor Center and Catherine Fisk at Berkeley Law School, and we analyzed, first of all, the text of the company's claimed freedom of association policy, and we also analyzed the company's conduct. What is it actually doing out in the field with respect to workers' organizing efforts, both before and after this statement that was issued on March 11th, with particular attention to the union organizing efforts in Bessemer, Alabama, and the two warehouses on Staten Island. And our report, which is titled "Failure to Deliver," you get the idea, found that Amazon indeed failed to deliver on both counts. The report, Amazon's policy on its face, fails to reflect international labor standards. They don't even, just for starters, and I'll, start and stop here, it doesn't even mention ILO conventions 87 and 98. And this is Amazon's, freedom of association policy. It doesn't mention those key conventions. And then you look at the conduct. What was Amazon actually doing in the midst, or around both sides before and after putting out this statement? It was undertaking vicious campaigns of fear and intimidation in the Amazon warehouses where workers were trying to organize, with their anti-union websites, and bringing in, spending millions of dollars on consultants, anti-union consultants, to run their anti-union campaigns, holding repeated mass captive audience meetings filled with threats and innuendo about the terrible things that are going to happen if workers form a union. Mobilizing, hiring local police off duty, but the police come in their police cars and in their police uniforms, even though they're off duty. They're engaged by Amazon to show up at the warehouse entrances and the parking lot and so on, just to create an air of intimidation around the whole effort. A lot of people in this audience know those kinds of things that go on, and I won't go into a lot of detail. I just want to zero in on a couple of key points related to the theme of this panel. One is that Amazon workers turned to organizing precisely because of the lack of collective bargaining in Amazon. It was prompted first, instigated first by the COVID crisis. Amazon's lack of transparency with workers and slowness in responding to the crisis. Workers were looking for answers and information, and Amazon wasn't telling them anything. And the frustration over that experience of the COVID crisis inside the warehouses was a major factor in sparking the union organizing effort. And they were also prompted to do it because of the lack of collective bargaining over health and safety generally, not just COVID-related health and safety, but over health and safety, and also over the Amazon's point system, the disciplinary system that results in workers being suspended or dismissed. And the whole disciplinary system is based on the pace of work, keeping up with the pace of work, which is set by an algorithm. And the workers have no idea what the algorithm is, how it's constructed. All they know is, the algorithm builds up their disciplinary points to the point where they get fired. And, this is a mandatory subject of bargaining. The pace of work is what also leads to so many injuries and other problems in Amazon. So these are the kinds of things that that Amazon workers lacked and felt a need for, and that's why they turned to organizing. And you compare that with what the UFCW was able to do with the supermarkets and what healthcare unions were able to do in nursing homes and hospitals, what the airline unions were able to do with airlines, and that was really to negotiate substantial protections in the COVID crisis. I'll just finish on this point that collective bargaining is really why Amazon is so viciously anti-union, and other companies that adopt the same stance. They could live with unions. It's fine if the workers want to have unions and elect officers and have meetings and even make demands. But it's the legal obligation to bargain, which is the real choke point for Amazon and other employers. They want that unilateral control over the workplace. They don't want to have to sit down and talk on an equal level with workers and their representatives. And that's really the key issue that has sparked organizing in Amazon. And I think that Dora's and Mark's reports underscore the importance of collective bargaining and why Amazon workers are doing what they're doing. I'll hold it there, and we'll look forward to the next round.
Thanks very much, Lance. And I think it sets up nicely for talking about practically in the world, what can we do to help foster more opportunities for collective bargaining and to help support freedom of association and workers having that ability to exercise voice in the workplace. And with that, I'd like to invite Molly to give a little bit of an overview of what the U.S. Department of Labor is helping to do in that regard.
Thank you, Sarah. And Lance, you inspired me. So let me just start by saying, unlike the other speakers that we've heard from this afternoon, I'm not an academic and I am not a researcher. So I'll draw a little bit on actual programs. But Lance, both you're starting with a personal story as well as what you were saying about Amazon made me think back to over 20 years ago when I was a union organizer in New York. And I worked for the Hotel Workers Union. This is not an international example at all. I just really like it. And it speaks very much to the point that Lance was making. the majority of the hotels in New York City are covered under what was a citywide collective bargaining agreement with the Hotel Association. There were a handful of hotels that were not in it, a very big Marriott and a couple others, including the Trump Tower Hotel, which is a campaign I just want to mention briefly. Those hotels knew very well that you couldn't pay less than the citywide agreement. So workers at those hotels got paid at the same sort of overtime rates. They made the same hourly rates. A number of the sort of basic economic conditions were the same as what you would find in a union hotel. But the Trump Tower workers, who spoke probably a couple dozen languages, they were from all over the world, came to the union and wanted to organize, not necessarily for economic reasons, because they weren't going to gain from that, but to have some accountability and some dialogue with the hotel management. And person after person said it was about respect. They wanted to be on the citywide contract because they wanted to have control over their schedules. They wanted to be on the citywide contract because they wanted to answer back when a supervisor, I remember one particular room attendant saying she was tired of getting yelled at because I guess she did the suites and there was this particular arrangement of like gold pillows that were supposed to be on the sofa in a certain way. And if the laundry didn't come through with some of them and like a gold pillow was out of place, she would get yelled at. And she was saying the reason we want the union is respect and we want to be able to talk back. And they resoundingly voted for the union, and now they're on the citywide contract. It was actually an example of organizing that I drew on a lot over the last several years. I'm like, okay, they could do it. They could do it. We can withstand this. But I could give countless other examples of why workers want collective bargaining, why they need it. But in the last 6 months I've been in the federal government, what I know and what probably everybody else knows as well is that we can't make policy based on anecdotes. I could draw on any number of experiences from my own career or my friends, like my friend who's a nurse texting me over the last year because like every other healthcare professional, she's exhausted from the pandemic, texting me about the new contract that the California Nurses Association negotiated that gave them more rest. And she was at her wit's end, and they were like, we worked out new pandemic protections and we worked out more time off because we're tired. But it's not enough for the work that I'm doing now. And one of the things that I keep finding is that while those of us with a union background or those of us that have done research with that sort of position understand why workers need collective bargaining, appreciate why workers want collective bargaining, there is simply not enough research that we can draw on or data to really show that it works. And that's why this report is so critical. I mean, it goes over all the sort of areas, that beautiful wheel that we saw of collective bargaining, whether it's on, yes, economic conditions or white collar employees negotiating telework models as they return to office, which is something we're in the process of at DOL. We need to make the case. And I also want to welcome and recognize Mark's research on Honduras. Just the mere statistic on workers covered under 25, workers with CBAs being 25% less likely to migrate was something that I wish I had in 2014 when we were talking about, the first sort of migration wave and the child migrants and the need for investment in decent work and not just border security. So this report is a beast. It's near 200 pages, I think, but it provides an exhaustive portrait of collective bargaining as it stands today, as well as the future of bargaining on things like telework, informal work, gig work, occupational safety and health, and its global data. And that's what people in the positions like the one that I am now need to inform our programs and priorities. So this report is proof that collective bargaining works. That said, one of the biggest challenges I think that we're facing here in the US, as well as in the countries we support programs in around the world, is that a union contract is still out of work for out of reach for a lot of workers. So they may be precariously employed. They may be employed part-time. They may be employed where there's not a formal employer that they can sit down at the table with. Or, more commonly and extremely commonly in the US, they're vastly outpowered by employers or governments that actively oppose workers' right to organize and have a voice at the job. And so the goal of the Biden-Harris administration, and you've seen this spoken by the president many times, is to make union organizing and collective bargaining easier for workers. Sarah, you tell me, I meant to start a timer that said 5 minutes because I know that's how much I said, but I actually didn't hit start. So I can touch on a couple things right now, but I can also come back when I know you're having round two because I added in way more at the beginning than I wanted to say.
Touch on a couple things now, and then we'll come back.
Okay, so let me just highlight two things. One, excuse me, one is the Task Force on Worker Organizing, which is a domestically focused effort. And we had found that nearly 60 million workers in the US say that they would join a union if given the chance. But as we all know, there's been a steady decline in union membership in the US over the last decade. And so the task force was an executive order to mobilize all of the federal government's policies, programs, and practices to empower workers to organize successfully and bargain with their employers. And it came up with like 70 something, or maybe just under 70 recommendations for ways to increase worker power for marginalized workers, including women and people of color, for workers in industries that are sort of notoriously difficult or lack labor protections, and of course, looking at the federal government's own responsibilities as an employer and as, you know, a massive entity that sets the tone for what's possible for workers. We are now working on the second edition of the task force report, which will follow up and deepen a lot of those recommendations, which again are focused on US workers, but we are hoping, and I am drafting as we speak, recommendations around what the US can do globally and how that impacts workers here in the US. Because I think, as Dora started out saying, and Mark hit on the beginning of his presentation as well, is that we're dealing with global supply chains, right? And so many, many levels of work, and at the very bottom of them, a lot of workers are just simply left out of the picture. They're subcontracted to the point that you can't say who they're exactly working for, and a lot of them don't have union contracts. I will go into detail on this when I have my sort of next focus 5 minutes after this, but an initiative that we're calling Empower, the Multilateral Partnership for Organizing Worker Empowerment and Rights, which we launched at the Summit for Democracy in December. We're working with the AFL-CIO, we're working with the ILO, of course, philanthropic organizations, and within the US government, it's USAID, Department of State, and us at the Department of Labor. And we have pledged over 120 million over 2 years. Just a minute, let me finish this. Okay, hold on, I got 1 minute and then I'll be right with you. Problem of having a Sunday afternoon during lunchtime and before nap time panel. 120 million in programs to support worker organizing around the world. We already have new programs that we've launched in Mexico and Central America, one of which helped contribute to a massive both organizing and now collective bargaining victory for workers in GM Silao, an auto plant, where they negotiated their first democratically negotiated collective bargaining agreement in the history of the factory just last month, with I think 8.5% raises on salaries and close to 14% on other economic benefits. I will be happy to talk more about that program on our next round, but I'll stop there because I'm pretty sure I'm out of time. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Molly. And yes, very exciting to see the recent agreement in Mexico. So the next round, so to speak, we actually have only 17 minutes, and we're going to get through a few other things, which will hopefully spark everyone's interest in following up with all of us later as well during either the breakout meetings or other times. But I'm going to group it in two. So Dora and Mark, if each of you can give me maybe just a couple of the most unique or exciting things about your data collection, the process that you went through. So Dora, maybe 2 minutes, and then Mark, maybe 2 minutes on that. Like operationally, how did you collect these? What were some of the biggest challenges? And I know that's tough to do in 2 to 3 minutes each, but doing that, and then I'll turn Lance and Molly to you for sort of a different direction. Go ahead, Dora first.
Thanks, Sarah. Just quickly to point out that actually on page, so the cover picture for chapter 1 is actually from the Mexican factory. So we wanted to include in the one that Molly just referred to, because we also just wanted to sort of acknowledge the importance of it. In terms of the data collection, yeah, the report, as most of you know, is very heavily data driven. It was grind work, I think, a lot of it. I think the most challenging is continuing to update the data on collective bargaining and coverage rate and trade union density and employers organization density rate. It's just simply that the data is a very complex data. It's not like other usual statistical indicators that statistical offices would collect. We deal with secrecy, we deal with just bad data management by trade unions or employers organizations, just not revealing often their data for various reasons. So this is what we had to do, is to go on the ground and hire experts in 20 plus countries who would then go door to door during the pandemic, I would also say, which did not help with the data collection, and try to actually gather the information from trade union books and like as much as availability was there for government data sets. So that really is country by country. There is no easy way to do that other than engaging with the countries and trying also to, let's say, put the questions into their labor force surveys. So we have some reliable data periodically, but we know that labor force surveys are expensive. So this is a very difficult task. I was mainly involved with the legal normative framework analysis. That was, again, just going into the national laws, and we dug up relevant laws for 125 countries with my colleague, and basically just read through the text and analyzed them, and then we consulted with our regional and country experts in the office. For the 500 plus collective bargaining agreements, we used the textual analysis software, so that was a very different process. But even for that, we actually had coders who studied the system that we used, and then delivered basically the coding for those agreements. Just to give a sample, just regional breakdown, we had 57 agreements from Africa, 130 from Americas, only 2 from the Arab states for obvious reasons, 91 from Asia and the Pacific, 231 from Europe and Central Asia, and there was 1 international agreement. And of course, again, this is through networks. It's not easy to find these agreements. Few countries have sort of a central registry where this would be available. It's knocking on doors, asking from other people. So we hope to continue, but yeah, it depends on budget and personal. So not an easy, but a very rewarding work nonetheless.
Thanks, Dora. Mark, and your process was more worker driven, right? So if you can, I think it's an interesting addition as well to the sort of global frame for the ILO.
Thanks. Yeah, and I did a couple of quick slides. Let me set my timer too. So I call it worker-driven, which builds on a term others are using, worker-driven social responsibility. So I'm calling it worker-driven research, which is similar to community-based or action-oriented research. There were really 3 parts to it. So similar to what Dora was talking about, we gathered every CBA, collective bargaining agreement in the sector. This was done working closely with Luis Mendoza, who's a labor lawyer from Peru, who's a graduate student of mine. We coded every single clause. We lined those up with labor code to see what the base was, what's vacation time, what's maternity leave. And we provided a summary of those findings. And then, yes, there was this worker-driven component. We interviewed 387 workers, about half had collective bargaining agreements, half did not. And this was done through a team of worker rights advocates, all of whom either work in the factories now and had some time off because they're shop stewards, or once worked in the factories. We did, I'll say a bit more about that, but then there was also interviews and field research. I actually managed the last 6 months to get to Honduras twice. This is actually a photo of the surveys going on. The workers were involved in the design, the implementation, and the analysis of the data. We also had weekly Zoom calls that often lasted for 2 hours, and that went on for most of the fall. And I think the impact of this research methodology is that the quality of the work was much higher. They were very involved, again, not only in gathering the data, but analyzing the findings. And incredibly importantly, they have much greater ownership now over the findings. They talk about it with great authority, and it's influenced their work. And even influenced the bargaining process, because they became aware of, these were two centers we were working with, the CGT and the FITH. They became aware of clauses and other agreements, and then brought that into bargaining going forward. I just thinking of what Molly was talking about. This is from the third component of the methodology, the interviews and so on, and just quotes from workers. We are listened to now. Management shows us greater respect as workers. There's less abusive treatment. The employers respect our rights now. So I think a very robust and important approach. And I hope to find ways to do more of it going forward. And I hope others will as well. And I'll just pop up the slide. This is the research team that I worked with in Honduras. So thanks.
That's great, Mark. And maybe just very quickly, how did you get willingness to spend so much time on 2-hour Zoom calls?
How did I get what?
How did you convince people that they should spend 2 hours on a Zoom call so regularly?
I think this is the worker-driven component. They were so interested in this. They told me stuff. They wanted to get the wire harnessing auto parts in. They wanted to get this data. They saw the importance of it. And that's when it's worker-driven. I'm just going, here's my research agenda, help me do it, versus what are the questions you want to explore? How do we explore them? How can we use this? But I'll tell you, it was a bit of there were people did the Zoom calls on the minibus going home from work, and all the noise in the background. They were in the house cooking dinner. Everything was going on. It was all good. We pushed our way through, and there were kids running all around as well. And it was all good. And I think it's a really rich report as a result of their engaged participation.
Thanks very much, Mark. I love it. So Lance, maybe a little bit less on the how, but turning towards other examples. I thought it was really interesting, you talking about why a company may or may not want collective bargaining and how you get there. There's a lot going on in the US right now, and I know you were going to mention maybe a few other examples.
Yeah, right. I guess, the most current example that I think everybody is aware of is Starbucks. And I want to sort of signal the challenge of how to structure collective bargaining in a company like Starbucks, which has thousands of individual stores around the country and around the world. Now, they solved this problem in Europe and other countries by having sectoral bargaining, so that the Starbucks and McDonald's and all the franchise type. Well, Starbucks is not a franchise, but all of those fast food type arrangements, they're covered by collective agreements bargained at the peak level. In the United States, we don't have that. And if I understand correctly, there have been about 65 bargaining units certified in Starbucks stores around the United States. There are 250 NLRB election petitions pending in Starbucks stores around the country. So we're looking at, if the trend continues, we're looking at, maybe in 6 months from now, 1,000 Starbucks stores that have to enter into collective bargaining. And there's a real capacity problem there, for the union and for Starbucks too. I mean, you can't just, have the local staff sit down with the store manager and negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. It's more complicated than that. It really does take some experience and expertise and knowledge of labor law and so on to put together a valid collective bargaining agreement. And it's a conundrum because the unions wanted to organize store by store because it's easier to win elections in the single store because that's where the employees know each other and work together and they have personal relationships and they're dealing with the same store manager and so on. And that dynamic among the workers themselves is really the key to union organizing success. Not the relationship between the outside union organizer and the workers, but the workers themselves. The problem now is, breaking through somehow at a multi-store level because collective bargaining can't be sustained on a store-by-store level in a company like Starbucks, some kind of system of regional or municipal. And actually, it's ironic because Starbucks, challenged the NLRB's determination of the appropriate unit, saying, no, we should have all the stores in the Buffalo area be treated as a single bargaining unit, and other municipalities and regions. And actually, for purposes of collective bargaining, that would be a lot better than bargaining store by store. But there wasn't the capacity to win NLRB elections on that basis. So there's a conundrum here. There's a problem that needs to be solved. The same thing arises in Apple stores, the Apple retail stores now. There's organizing interest there. And these same challenges of how do you structure collective bargaining in a sector where it's many hundreds and sometimes thousands of single location bargaining units. That's a problem that workers and unions are going to have to solve in months and years ahead.
Thanks, Lance, and hopefully drawing from other examples of what has worked might help in that regard, along with labor law reform, which seems like a bigger challenge. But Molly, can you close us out with just going forward, what you're looking at, and a little bit more on Empower, as you had mentioned that earlier?
Yeah, let me just say a couple quick things about Empower. First was the reason that we decided it was time to do it. Obviously, we have a pro-labor, pro-union administration, and so it made sense to us that now, I mean, the US government has always had some investments in labor programs. They've taken different shapes. Sometimes they're child labor programs. Sometimes they look a little bit more focused on corporate social responsibility. But under the current administration, we had the opportunity to focus on worker organizing. And I say this, this is a panel hosted by the ILO. We absolutely believe in social dialogue. We support social dialogue, but we recognize you cannot have effective social dialogue, just as you can't have effective collective bargaining, if workers cannot organize, if they're threatened when they organize, if they're crushed by powerful corporations, or if they're, as Lance was saying, a tiny bargaining unit at the far end of a global supply chain, who aren't working on a brand, who are working for a commodity, and no one knows what happens to the sugar that they harvest, what brand it ends up in. They don't have a lot of bargaining power. And so our focus with Empower is to put the emphasis on worker organizing through program support, but also on changing the way that the government deals with unions and listens to unions. And so we have not had a lot of opportunities in many countries outside of these sort of formal tripartite structures where governments are hearing directly from unions about a lot of the issues that we're confronting today that we do want to negotiate on, the things like climate change and just transition, occupational safety and health in the wake of the pandemic and beyond it, and obviously economic conditions. One of the things that we're challenged by is, this is not a news story, but the economy is changing. We have more workers employed in gigs, more workers employed without traditional employers. And we are not going to resolve that as sort of policymakers or government administrations. We will not come up with the best ideas unless we're hearing from workers. So Empower is about that. We've started with a core in the US group, and just some of the things I outlined are some of the things that have been mentioned to us, the threats against sort of organizers as activists in a specific way, but also the general threat of closing space for civil society when citizens can't organize, when they can't deal on a level playing field with their government. They can't do that with their employers either. And so we are committed as the US government, yes, to continue to fund programs that support worker organizing directly, but also to work in a new way with unions around the world. We're talking to other governments about joining us in this initiative. We're partnering with the International Trade Union Confederation, who's bringing its affiliates on board. And we're in the nascent stages, but we're really hopeful that by focusing directly on workers' right to organize, worker freedom of association, we will be setting up sort of the building blocks for workers to be able to negotiate. And as this report testifies to, as Mark's report and Lance's research, it is an enabling right. Everything we're trying to achieve on economic development, on gender equity, on racial disparities, if workers have the power to negotiate that directly, they will, but we got to give them the tools to organize so that they can do that. So that's where our focus is now. And I will stop there.
Thanks, Molly. And I think it's the perfect place to end. Exactly that. So thanks everyone for joining us here today. Thanks very much to our panel for the spending part of your Sunday afternoon here. And to those of you going on to other panels in the afternoon, I wish you all the best. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.